I would like to welcome all of you. I know that there's probably still some people coming. It's the very first time that we're using this space for a lecture and the panels tomorrow morning. I think it's a wonderful space, but there's a change in culture from the old auditorium to this new space. So we're a little already over time, and I think the best is to just get it started. I am obviously delighted to welcome you tonight to this two-day symposium that aims to explore art in the contemporary refugee. We will begin tonight with a keynote lecture by Professor Thomas Keenan entitled How to Make a Refugee. The symposium itself is intended to create time, which we never have, to think and discuss the sociopolitical condition of mass migration, with worldwide more than 70 million people displaced, and how this state of emergency is mediated through art, culture, and theory in recent years. First of all, I wanted to thank Professor Svea Breunert, for co-organizing this symposium with me. I'm also very grateful to all symposium participants from near and far for their contributions over the next 2 days. Papers will focus on narratives, memorials, and communities as they are addressed in the work of individual artists such as Ai Weiwei, Jenny Erpenbeck, Omar Fast, Lawrence Abdu Hamden, in exhibitions focusing on specific geopolitical conditions and contexts, such as the US-Mexico border and within theoretical frameworks. I also would like to welcome Washington University faculty, students, staff, and the St. Louis public. Thank you for being with us tonight and tomorrow. The exhibition Ai Weiwei Bare Life, as well as the symposium, would not have been possible without the support of the William T. Kemper Foundation, Bunny and Charles Burson, Barbara Eagleton, Emily and Teddy Greenspan, Elissa and Paul Kahn, Nancy and Ken Krensberg, the Conson family and PGAV Destinations, the Missouri Arts Council, the Hortense Lewin Art Fund, and individual museum members. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge how grateful I am to Jamie Fott, who's standing there, for taking care of the really complicated logistics of the symposium. Without her, we would not gather here today, I can promise you. It is probably obvious to all of you that the pragmatic occasion for this symposium is the exhibition Ai Weiwei Bare Life. On view in the large thematic section, Bare Life, of this exhibition are some of Ai's work that visualize the worldwide refugee crisis. His work about refugees is similar to his entire oeuvre, developed in a very broad variety of media. The monumental wallpaper mural Odyssey narrates the journey of refugees, as do Chinese blue and white painted porcelain vases and plates. Assisted ready-mades of tear gas canisters, a marble sculpture of 3 tires, which refugees frequently use when crossing the Mediterranean Sea, can be seen as memorials. Lastly, documentary videos capturing the conditions at the Gaza Strip, at the Contemporary Refugee Camp Idomeni, and the border at Calais challenge the viewer to closely observe the reality of what it means to be a refugee today. This section of the exhibition was conceived in an effort to establish a dialogue between Ai's work and important philosophical deliberations, namely Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben's treatise Homo Sacer, Sovereign Power and Bare Life, in which he examines the history of Homo Sacer, the one who is forced to endure a condition of bare, biological, or unrecognized life, often deprived of citizenships and unprotected through a nation state. In these artworks, I combines realism with conceptualism to elevate and make visible the figure of the refugee and the experience of migration and flight. Many of his installations and sculptures visualize movement, figuratively and abstracted, to condense the reality of an infinite, often indirected journey, and that maybe you can see best on one of his newest works that was conceived after a Twitter feed of June 2019. And in the Twitter feed, as you can see it here, you see the undirected movement of Sea-Watch, that ship that was cruising in front of Lampedusa for quite some time and was not able to dock. So this is just a digital image or an abstracted image of that movement of the ship, and is then translated by into a monumental Lego piece. Much of his artistic approach focuses on how to document, to narrate, to beautify, to memorialize, and to monumentalize precarious life. In order to put forth his worldwide concerns for social justice, human rights, and freedom of expression, I creates hybrid artistic languages drawn from high art and popular culture, from Eastern and Western traditions, yet also from ancient and modern ones, to insist on a universal urgency of coexistence of cultures of a shared world. In addition, in particular, his semi and documentaries such as Human Flow 2017 and The Rest 2019 bring to visibility, thereby augmenting the enormous extent of the crisis, political context, the everyday reality of those expelled, and the ways in which refugees are neglected and mistreated around the world. Humans whose basic rights have been violated attained centrality through an artistic process in which art and politics, in a broad spectrum of different art forms and iconographies, encounter each other. These, one could argue, establish new, I hope, multiplicities, fluid, universal, and multidirectional, that put forward the artist's quest as art as a fundamentally humanizing endeavor. Yet, A is not alone in feeling the urgency to bring to visibility the plight of refugees and the contemporary phenomenon of mass migration that is currently changing the composition of populations, especially in Europe. Exhibitions such as The Warmth of Other Suns, Stories of Global Displacement, curated by Massimiliano Giuni and Natalie Bell, presented at Washington, D.C.'s Phillips Collection, included 75 contemporary and historical artists from many countries around the world who addressed in their work experiences and perceptions of exile and emigration, turning it into a universal phenomenon. Currently on view at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston is the exhibition When Home Won't Let You Stay, Migration Through Contemporary Art, that will travel to the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts, among other venues. Focused solely on contemporary art in a variety of media, the exhibition highlights the ways through which 20 selected artists today visualize displacement, the figure of the refugee, and the experience of migration. From a multitude of perspectives, these exhibitions and artworks ask pressing questions and pose important issues about exiles and émigrés. Questions that are, of course, relevant to the presentations and discussions that inform this symposium. I want to highlight some. Is the figure of the refugee an individual or a collective phenomenon? Or is it a universal meditation, or maybe both? What role do hybrid cultural languages play in the depiction of exiles and émigrés? Can one just document human rights violations, or is that a political act? Are compassion and empathy important means to visualize the refugee experience? Are past and current refugees and their images connected to each other? Is the contemporary humanitarian imagination penetrated by the condition of the refugee? Is the experience of displacement part of narratives of humanity? What does statelessness mean today in light of rising nationalisms everywhere? Are modernist issues of assimilation versus isolation still relevant? In any case, I hope we will have much opportunity over the next couple days to discuss these and other questions. It is my pleasure now finally to introduce Thomas Keenan. He's an associate professor in comparative literature at Bard College, where he teaches media theory, literature, and human rights. He directs the Human Rights Project, a program that provides students with the opportunity to learn about and have proactive engagement with the human rights movement. His research interests include media and conflict, literacy and political theory, and violence and politics. He has served on boards of a number of human rights organizations and journals, including Witness, Scholars at Risk, the Journal of Human Rights and Humanity. He's the author of Fables of Responsibility and co-wrote Mengeles' Skull. He's co-editor of New Media, Old Media, of The Human Snapshot, and Flood of Rights, and is co-curator of anti-photojournalism, and it is obvious from the map, a project of mapping and migration, which was shown at the Istanbul Design Biennial, Red Cat in Los Angeles, and the Galerie Nova in Zagreb. Please join me now to welcome Thomas Keenan for this keynote speech.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sabina. Thank you, Svea. Thank you, Jamie, and amazing space we're in. Let's see, how do I wanted to start with the same image. Oh no, I just go like that. Because I wanted to, I don't know if you can exactly dedicate a keynote lecture, but mark an important phenomenon, take this opportunity to mark an important phenomenon right now, which is the criminalization of humanitarian search and rescue, not only in the Mediterranean, but this is a beautiful icon of the Mediterranean situation, but also at the southern border of the United States, where the humanitarian volunteers of No More Deaths are currently on trial for leaving water in the desert. Among those criminals, humanitarian criminals, is a student of ours at Bard College's Berlin branch, Sarah Mardini, who was arrested in Greece last year for providing rescue services to newly arrived migrants in the islands. So I'd like them all to be with us this evening, and this is an icon of that. Okay. My title is appropriated from that of a short film made by the British artist Phil Collins in May of 1999. It's shot in the refugee camps on the Macedonia-Kosovo border that were temporarily home to many of the hundreds of thousands of Kosovars deported by Serbian troops and police forces before and during the NATO air campaign. Collins took his camera into those camps and accompanied the journalists and human rights investigators who were speaking with refugees. How to Make a Refugee is an unusual 12-minute portrayal of one such encounter. Packed into a small room with a crowd of journalists and two families from Kosovo, Collins's camera documents the visual and narrative practices by which the figure of the refugee is constructed. Reporters interview, through a translator, a 15-year-old boy who tells the story of his family's flight from Kosovo and the violent interruptions of that journey by the Serbian police and Macedonian border guards. He has been injured, and he takes off his shirt to reveal the stitches closing what seems to be a bullet wound in his abdomen, and lifts up his leg to show that it's been broken and in a cast. All the while, flashbulbs are popping, people are moving around, light meters are positioned in front of his face, his baseball cap is taken off and put back on, and Collins's camera, participating in the production without being fully part of it, shows us not only his story and injuries, but also their presentation and documentation. It's a document of the document. The second half of the film shows us the somewhat odd wrangling by one of the photographers of the boy's family and the other family with whom they are living onto a not large enough couch for a group portrait. Once positioned, everyone smiles as their portrait picture is taken, the news teams pack up and leave, and the film ends. I'm going to show you the first 2 minutes or so of the film just to give you a sense of how Collins does this. Whoops.
Maybe all of, maybe all of.
No, it's better we don't. No, it's better we don't. No, skip that.
Beşir, B, E, Beşir, S, H, E, R.
Sorry,
Would you ask how old he is? Soviet again?
I had two of them playing at the same time, sorry.
And it happened at the border, the black.
Ka ke kalu ka vllaca apo?
Jo, ka Malina.
Ka Malina.
There we go. Sorry about that. The film is generally interpreted as an expose of the tropes and strategies by which the news media constructs humanitarian or disaster narratives. It exposes the mechanisms of the exposure of suffering. The mise en scène, the framing of the story, is brought into the frame and becomes the story itself. The implication seems to be that the refugee is made by the cameras and reporters, hence the title. The refugee does not so much present himself as be represented by others. One reviewer summarizes this line of interpretation as follows: each element comes together within the frame, and the boy, at first identifiably human, vanishes into the image. The cliché, Muslim, rural, peasant, poor, is accomplished. The subject is ready for consumption. Unquote. This interpretation repeats the general theorem according to which refugees are, or are made to be, speechless emissaries, in the much-quoted words of the anthropologist Lisa Mulkey. I see something else going on here. I see a claim being made, and the making visible of the apparatus that constructs and transmits that claim. The refugee, 15-year-old Besher Haldi, speaks and tells a story, presents himself, not under conditions of his own choosing. Are there ever, though, conditions entirely of one's own choosing? But under the conditions that are necessary for his speech to be heard and the marks on his body to be seen. I see evidence being presented, an admission that evidence does not speak for itself, but needs transmitters, ventriloquists, translators, staging. I see a collaboration, asymmetrical to be sure, a non-ideal, but nevertheless a speech situation. A few years later, in a very different film called, in Serbian, Why I Don't Speak Serbian in Serbian, Collins returned to other parts of his footage from those camps. In the midst of a longer film composed of studio interviews shot in black and white, Kosovar politicians, public figures, and ordinary people speaking in what we used to call Serbo-Croatian, they call it Serbian, about why they no longer speak that language. In the midst of this, we find about 5 minutes of color film of the camp's inhabitants going about their daily camp lives, interrupted by, attracted by, Collins's camera. Like the sit-down interviews, they are also portraits, children and families playing, promenading, selling, buying, building, eating, but most of all, posing. I'll show you a little bit of that film. You can see that's the, let me make this big. Come on. So you can see this is what most of the film looks like. That's where that segment ends. In an interview, Collins recalled his time in those camps. So those are the same camp, the inside press conference and the outdoor film of this. Collins recalled his time in those camps, and he surprises his interviewer with this claim. He says, "It sounds ridiculous now, and it's difficult for me not to romanticize the situation or my role within it. But I distinctly remember that not to have taken a picture would have been an insult. And his interviewer says, not to take it? He says, every few minutes or every few steps I made, someone would say, take my picture. They wanted some marker, as if this chaos needed to be recorded. Here's the most incredible sentence. Even when I had no film left, simply to take the picture without film was a necessary transaction, which justified my presence there. There was also a specific etiquette to the manner in which relationships between them and myself were established. What is amazing to me is the way people stand still for the camera. It becomes almost like posing for a portrait, as you would do for a stills camera. Unquote. So here's the question of this paper in an initial form, a question about one mode in which the relation between art and the contemporary refugee can be articulated. Why do people in refugee camps stand still for other people with cameras? Here's a second form of the question. Why is it that so often in such varied places, in so many languages, over so many years, people find themselves in situations where they need to say what would otherwise seem to be the most obvious, most superfluous, most taken for granted thing imaginable, namely that they are human beings? Let me run through a highly selective slideshow of images and phrases that exemplify this very strange but commonplace event. In 1787, this statement took an extended and interrogative form in what became the leading emblem of the British campaign to end the slave trade, the medallion produced by the workshop of Josiah Wedgwood, showing a kneeling African figure in chains looking upwards, hands clasped and gesturing towards an undepicted other. The caption of the medallion transcribes the gesture as a question. Am I not a man and a brother? Is this question rhetorical, which is to say doesn't really need to be asked because its answer is self-evident? Is it simply a more persuasive way of stating the obvious? Or does the utterance pose a real question, a question that needs nothing more urgently than an answer and someone else to answer it? This question would then imply not self-evidence, but exclusion, hierarchy, supremacy, ownership, and exploitation. It would be saying, I have not been treated as a man and a brother, and I demand a change. I ask, and perhaps might do more than just ask, but the answer can only come from you. I claim kinship, brotherhood with you, and seek recognition as precisely that sort of thing that I have heretofore been treated as not being, a human being. From a clearly inferior position, the figure requests equality, equal treatment. More than a century later, the sanitation workers of Memphis, Tennessee, on strike from February through April 1968, and famously supported by the Reverend Martin Luther King, it's where he was assassinated, marched in the streets wearing signs bearing the most condensed form of that claim. I am a man. Addressing the strikers, their local leader, the Reverend Herbert Lawson, had said, "For at the heart of racism is the idea that a man is not a man, that a person is not a person. You are human beings. You are men." Unquote. The signs claimed this, the marchers demonstrated it, but precisely not as something that could be taken for granted. Taking to the streets, making the claim, only makes sense against the background of a practice, a legal and political and social system by which a man is not a man. Wedgwood's medallion was cast long ago, and we are now half a century from the Memphis strike. The Atlantic slave trade ended, slavery in the British colonies was legally abolished, African Americans successfully campaigned for political equality, more or less. But these perplexing sentences, questions, and statements keep coming. There are too many examples of this. I've just returned from teaching in Malta, where the search and rescue ships remain impounded in the harbor of Valletta, and the refugees who do manage to arrive on the island are themselves effectively imprisoned in detention centers in conditions that led, while I was there, to an uprising in the camp at Safi. The protesters hung this sign on the barbed wire fence. It too was a claim and a question, a demand for what ought to go without saying. You can't read the top line, but it says, "We migrants, not criminals, to be or to burn," it's not clear, "in jail. Where is human right and EU?" Likewise, at the southern border of the United States, or let's call it the geographical border, since the effective US border now begins at the southern edge of Mexico and sometimes deeper into Central America, the same claim is made. We are human, say protesters in Arizona. Congress holds hearings on the separation of families of the newly arrived at the border and investigates the conditions in the camps where the children are detained, and the refrain is the same. Immigrants are human beings, says Congressman Adam Schiff. None of us would have our children in that position, says the late Representative Elijah Cummings. They are human beings. Our European and Middle Eastern colleagues do not need to be reminded of this, but for the rest of us, let me recall what we were reading and watching 4 years ago, right around now, in the fall of 2015. Here are the first paragraphs of a Reuters story from September 1st, 2015, datelined Budapest. Hundreds of angry migrants demonstrated outside Budapest's Eastern Railway terminus on Tuesday, demanding that they be allowed to travel on to Germany, as the biggest ever influx of migrants into the European Union left its asylum policies in tatters. Around 1,000 people waved tickets, clapping, booing, and shouting, "Germany, Germany," outside the station. Later they sat down, staring at a police blockade erected at the entrance. "Please, we are human too," said a sign in German, held up by a young boy in a smaller group which had protested into the evening. And I don't know if you can read it in the caption of this photo, but it includes the phrase "Wir sind Menschen," attributed to this crowd. So other German news reports likewise refer to signs that read simply, "Wir sind auch Menschen," we are humans too, or we are also humans. 3 days later, there were still people stuck in that train station, and the mood was a little different. The trains to Germany and the informal €200 taxis to the border were much less plentiful, and the Hungarian authorities were beginning to redirect asylum seekers to camps within Hungary. Another news report told their story this way, quoting Syrian refugee Bashar al-Nusrat, who said in broken English, "We don't want to go to camp. We pay our money to move on. We skip," and I think it's escape, "from our country because our army killing us and breaking us. So better we stay in Syria, in our house, not to sleep in the floor here." He said he's been invited to Germany and is desperate to get there. "We are not animals, we are human. If they are human too, we need something. We need to know what will happen to us." That day, those refugees took matters into their own hands. What became known under the slogan and hashtag March of Hope was a trek on foot from Budapest to the Austrian border and then beyond. Two activists, Bernd Kasparek and Mark Speer, characterized it this way: "The images of this march will surely find their place in the iconography of this long summer of migrations. A long line of people who, after a week of waiting, reappropriated their own mobility and collectively left Budapest." Unquote. "Wir sind auch Menschen." Please, this is the address. We are humans too. We are animals, we are human. And we insist that this difference be recognized by those who already call themselves human. The claim needs to be made because recognition is what we want, and it can only come from others. We want to be treated differently by them, seen and heard in a new way, as something new. They treat us as, or as if we were, animals. Al-Nusrat's compressed protest cites sleeping on the floor and not having a sense of what will happen next in his life. And we want to move from that category to another. And here's the paradox of this kind of claim. We need to claim this, but it only makes sense because we are already human, just like the others whom we address. So at once we are and we're not and need to claim. Humanity then is not a baseline or a ground. It's a claim and an accomplishment when it's accepted, but it's a contingent one. These most obvious statements still need to be uttered, and they need to be demonstrated, put into action, performed, and materialized. Hence the march in Memphis and in Budapest, the enactment or the reappropriation, in that nice word, of the capacity to flee and to move, the claim to space and to voice. The claim to be human and the march to the border need to be thought of together. They are claims to what ought to go without saying, but in fact needs to be said and heard. And they seek to put what is presently denied into contention, into negotiation, up for grabs. I take from these examples this lesson. There's a battle about who or what counts as a human being, and there are no naturally occurring or pre-given rules controlling the outcome of this battle. The outcome of the battle sets, in fact, the rules at any given time. Claiming that I am a man, or we are also humans, is a manner of challenging the existing definition of membership, disputing the rules of inclusion. This is not a metaphysical contest or a rhetorical exercise in the dismissive sense of the term, but a political one. It's a battle over access to politics or political life, a claim to share a world with others. We can read this in the little word too, auch. We are also humans, or we are humans too. In the comparison or the extension of the claim to equality, it's a comparison or an extension. In the comparison or the extension is a claim to equality. Although where one sleeps, on the floor or in a house, and what one can imagine about one's future might seem to be the most private of matters, Mr. Al-Nusrat makes them public and political, disputes the fact that he's presently denied that to which others have access. Claiming humanity is not to reassert ownership over something one has lost. It is to dispute its definition, challenge its monopolization by others, put it into play. Now, there's perhaps no more essential or more powerful narrator and interpreter of our long century of refugees than Hannah Arendt, herself a refugee. And I wrote this before I knew that she was a figure in the exhibition across the way. What we learn from her echoes my starting point this evening. Refugees are made. They do not occur naturally. They are made by violence and catastrophe, whether by war or markets or what she gently calls discrimination. They are made by law and convention as well. And they are made in words and images addressed to others, sent to and conditioned by those others from whom some sort of response is demanded. Refugees depend on others. This does not mean that they are powerless, speechless, or deprived of agency, although sometimes this does happen. On the contrary, precisely because they depend on others, they need recognition in the eyes and ears of others. They make claims. This means, in other words, that refugees have something to prove. The conjoined motifs of how we look to others, what we have to prove, and how we are treated structure Arendt's very strange short text from 1943 called We Refugees, which I'll introduce to you now. The very title is not simply an apposition or a definition or the name of a speaking subject. It stakes a claim, makes a demand on others. We Refugees means we are refugees, even if the first thing she underlines is that we don't like to be called by that name. And the second is that our particular condition turns on its head the traditional predicates attached to that subject. Refugees historically have been refugees because, she says, of some act committed or some political opinion held, unquote. And Arendt's refugees had done neither. They were simply Jewish. Nevertheless, she makes the claim to be a refugee. We have had to seek refuge, she says. We have arrived in a new country without means, and we have had to be helped by refugee committees. And during the previous stops on the journey, even when flight was more voluntary than it later became, she says the refugees were even more sensitive about that name, while still making claims and presenting themselves to others. We did our best to prove to other people, she writes in the third paragraph of the essay, that we were just ordinary immigrants. You can hear her irony and the bitterness of her critique of her fellow travelers' denial. You can also hear her honesty, her confrontation with the reality that there are no refugees without the ritual and rhetoric of proof, or to speak more precisely, without the presentation of evidence. Success is not guaranteed. We did our best, she says, to prove what we were. The pages that follow that bold introduction take an unexpected turn to the phenomenon of suicide among refugees, which she interprets, finally, if hesitantly, as perhaps the last and supreme guarantee of human freedom, unquote. A claim to the exercise of agency and a demand for recognition, not as a refugee, but as a human being, made from the outermost limit of human life, a claim, in fact, made from the grave. Even that, she says, the freedom and agency of the human being has to be claimed, enacted, demonstrated. Now, from this extreme, Arendt retreats, but the paradigm is established. What refugees seek is to be recognized as somebodies, she says. Once we were somebodies about whom people cared. Or sadly, as something more basic, without any particular characteristics, simply as a dignified human being. Her emphasis is on what she calls treatment, how we are treated by others. She says, there is also the deep despair of that middle-aged man who, going through countless shifts of different committees in order to be saved, finally exclaimed, "And nobody here knows who I am." Since nobody would treat him as a dignified human being, he began sending cables to great personalities and his big relations. He quickly learned that in this mad world, it is much easier to be accepted as a great man than as a human being. The quest for acceptance, the project of being treated as a human being, leads her fellow refugees, says Arendt, down all sorts of equally strange paths, which she nicknames variously putting up a front, playing roles, pretending to be something else. Very few individuals, she writes, have the strength to conserve their own integrity when their social, political, and legal status is completely confused. Lacking the courage to fight for a change of our social and legal status, we have decided instead, so many of us, to try a change of identity, to become something different for the audience. This distinction between status and identity is crucial for her, but not an easy one to maintain in the reality she describes. For all the attempts to claim an identity or a status seem to lead back inexorably to a void or a fissure where there ought to be a ground. There is only the purely contingent, treatment-based, social, which is to say constructed, character of the human status. As she later emphasized in the chapter on human rights in the origins of totalitarianism, and this is sort of a teaser for that book, there's nothing to be taken for granted and lots to lose when you do about the sheer fact of being human. Even that fact is a social one, relational, dependent on others. It is entirely possible, she writes in Origins, that, quote, the loss of home and political status can become identical with being expelled from humanity altogether. In We Refugees, This leads to the remarkable warning against imagining that being human as such, that being nothing but human beings, is a defense against anything. She says, if we should start telling the truth that we are nothing but Jews, it would mean that we expose ourselves to the fate of human beings who, unprotected by any specific law or political convention, are nothing but human beings. I can hardly imagine an attitude more dangerous, since we actually live in a world in which human beings as such have ceased to exist for quite a while, since society has discovered discrimination as the great social weapon by which one may kill men without any bloodshed, since passports or birth certificates and sometimes even income tax receipts are no longer formal papers, but matters of social distinction, unquote. A world in which human beings as such have ceased to exist for quite a while, thanks to the discrimination that kills without leaving any marks. We refugees and others do not start as human beings. It is not something that goes without saying, not a fact of birth or of life. Being human in the world in which we actually live is not to be taken for granted, but is only something granted. And hence it must be claimed, vouched for, and defended. Arendt shows us a rhetorical, documentary, forensic contest, a battlefield on which the weapons are passports, birth certificates, tax receipts, and where what is at stake is a battle for acceptance. The terrain of social distinction is also the territory of social death. She protests against this while insisting on its reality and actuality. If we refugees want to be recognized, we are going to have to get engaged in the messy business of claiming, demonstrating, documenting, offering evidence, and persuading the others on whose social standards we depend. There are better and worse ways of doing this, though, and as sympathetic as she is to the plight and the maneuvers of those with whom she says we, she is nevertheless also harsh in her judgment of some of the ruses, her word, and odd disguises they adopt in the quest for acceptance. History, she concludes, has forced the status of outlaws upon us. Many, she worries, have not accepted this and persist in the useless quest to change who they are. But, quote, those few refugees who insist on telling the truth, even to the point of indecency, get in exchange for their unpopularity one priceless advantage. History is no longer a closed book to them, and politics is no longer the privilege of the Gentiles, unquote. Lindsay Stonebridge, in a beautiful reading of what she calls refugee style in Arendt's essay, brought this word indecent to our attention. She writes, there seems to be no bridge, Arendt notes in The Human Condition, from the most radical subjectivity in which I am no longer recognizable to the outer world of life, unquote. She, Arendt, is writing about the experience of pain in that case, but that most radical subjectivity surely also recalls something of the plight of the refugee. This is still Stonebridge. Like the suffering body, the body of the refugee is not recognized by the outer world. To speak from within the subjectivity of the refugee, then, is to bring the concealed into public light, which might be why Arendt chooses to describe such a telling as indecent. The indecency of refugee style, we might say, is the writing of the vanguard, a writing back into the public and political realms from the position of the stateless. How does one become recognizable? It may seem as if there is a vast gulf that separates the fierce bravery of the truth-teller from the desperate quest for recognition. But Stonebridge shows us that indecency captures the radicality of both outspokenness and of unveiling and undressing. Think back to Becher Haldi. The insistent demand that tries to conjure into existence a bridge from invisibility and inaudibility to recognition or even membership in a community, which is to say, that claims the right to politics, to wrest it away from those who have seized it as their exclusive privilege. One way of phrasing that claim is to say, we are also human beings. There is a difference, Arendt shows us, between taking this for granted, the dangerous folly of those who fall back on being human as such in the hope that it will function as some sort of safety net, on the one hand, and on the other hand, having the courage to see that even human status must be asserted, demanded, and fought for, and that this is a political struggle, a struggle for politics itself. In closing, I want to return to the Budapest train station and the Macedonian camps. The speakers whose demands I quoted earlier were not just accidentally or inadvertently left out of political life. It's not a simple omission, not a matter of haste or a momentary lapse that excluded them from participation or recognition. At any given moment, there is a line or lines demarcating who counts as a member of the community and who doesn't. This is easy to see when we're talking about citizenship, but the structure extends to any and all such communities, even ones that proclaim their universal extension and radical openness have to make decisions, conscious or not, about the minimal requirements for inclusion, whether they are seemingly trivial ones like age or species, or seemingly vicious ones like race or gender. Discrimination, to use Arendt's term, is always happening. The existing features of any political sphere, the constitution of the community at any given time, is premised on exclusion. One cannot wish or theorize this away. One can only put up with it or challenge it. This is what Arendt means when she insists on both the risk and the necessity of challenging the monopolization of politics by the authorities, whoever they are. Politics, the right to politics, is there to be claimed. And the story of politics is about the challenges and the contests over these lines of demarcation, over who counts as a participant. Or to put it a bit more carefully, it's about projects to politicize subjects and topics that have not been understood as topics for public discussion. And in the other direction, lest you think this is always a happy story, about projects to put certain subjects and issues out of political contest, to naturalize or depoliticize them. Being expelled from humanity, as Arendt says, is no longer an unusual occurrence. Which means that humanity is a political issue and an aesthetic one. We are that issue, precisely because it's not clear who we are. We are the ones deciding, which is to say debating, contesting and demonstrating, arguing and visualizing who we are. The history of human rights is the history of arguments and battles about who humans are, about who counts as us. This contest, these declarations, claims, and the responses they provoke, is conducted in tropes, narratives, sounds, and images. Phil Collins showed us that this sort of declaration is fundamentally aesthetic, performative, demonstrative. And that happens even when it's not part of something we conventionally understand as an artwork. Becher Haldi and this little girl who said, "Take my picture," she's in that film before the part that I showed you. Becher Haldi, this little girl who said, "Take my picture," and the marchers in Memphis all knew this. And the refugees in Budapest, speaking and marching, filling public highways and airwaves with their demands, were repeating and enacting this declaration. Time will tell about how well they did it, about whether they managed to make themselves heard. We are humans too, far from being obvious, is both a challenge and a challenge to hear. How did those who have no standing, whom we do not recognize as one of us, who do not count and who do not even appear before us as fellow political subjects, how do they make themselves heard and attended to? These are not rhetorical or overly dramatic questions. Think of how long it took for slaves to be registered or recognized as human beings, a struggle that still has not been definitively accomplished, or for torture to be abolished, also not exactly a done deal. And for good reason, as it were. If membership in the community is premised on the exclusion of others from it, then the identity and self-understanding of those who do count depend precisely on not being those who don't. So when the excluded say, "Count us, we are humans too, like you," they are not asking simply to make the space of the community bigger, to add some extra chairs to the table, as it were. They are asking for a new space, a new table, and a new definition of who it is that sits at it. When they are recognized, heard, admitted, the definition of who we all are undergoes a shift. It's no wonder that these matters are so strongly contested and that people have to keep contesting them. Thank you. I'm happy to talk, answer questions.
Quick comment. I really liked the way that you used the situation of the black slave. And in your sort of discussion about the problem we have with migrants is this dehumanization and otherization of them. But just be cautioned a little bit, because slaves got here a little differently, and you don't want to fall into that Ben Carson comment that we were immigrants, sort of coming over. But I think it's an important kind of contact that I think we African Americans need to sort of recognize to sort of enlarge their dialogue globally. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's always the peril of analogies and comparisons. So, thank you.
So I have a question about the concept of recognition. Insofar like the humanity of someone depends on their being recognized, presumably by a majority of citizens, isn't that a problem? In other words, wouldn't we want to come up with a notion of a person that would be a person whether a majority of citizens acknowledge that or not? It seems to me that recognition is a mode of humanism, and that as such it's quite risky. So, and towards the end of your talk, we're moving towards a kind of a suggestion that perhaps we need a new mode of politics, right? One in which recognition perhaps is not a mode of inclusion and exclusion. Right. So I would want to hear your thoughts more on the relationship between recognition, humanism, and what counts as politics as a function of recognition.
Okay. Thank you. So I think my position, and I think Arendt's position, and I think a number of other people who are kind of thinkers who are lurking in the background here, is that Arendt says it most painfully and powerfully that presuming that there is such a thing as a person or a human being just in advance is a losing proposition, that nothing protects the human being as such. That's the bitter lesson that she draws from the migration crisis after the First World War and the outcome of the Second World War, that that homelessness becomes refugeedom, becomes statelessness, becomes superfluity, disposability. And that what we thought in the general framework of human rights language, what we thought was the safety net or the bedrock of things that belong to us purely insofar as we're born human, is not there. So she wants to understand how we do acquire some kind of status or capacity to be protected. Sometimes she talks about it in terms of falling inside the pale of the law or being covered by the law, but sometimes it doesn't quite require a law for her. And there, I think, her logic is that one needs to be recognized, accepted, welcomed by those who are doing the excluding. So there's some kind of dialogue or dynamic between those who are out and those who are in. You can do that in a soft, liberal way, in which the outsider seeks to change him or her or themselves into what the inside already is. So the mode of assimilation and so on. And that's what she is ruthless about in We Refugees. That this is also a hopeless proposition, trying to be what they are. So the only remaining move, it seems to me, is to understand that the demand for recognition has to be an act of persuasion, which persuades the listener, first of all, to hear the fact that I'm saying something in the first place, which is exclusion is partly exclusion from voice and exclusion from being a part of the conversation. But I have to persuade the other not only to recognize me, but in recognizing me, that other has to change what they think they are. So there's a radical shift there in the meaning of what a member of the community is. So when and if, let's pick on Germany. When if Germany decides that those million Syrians who arrived in 2015 do actually belong there, then what it means to be German will have changed. It's not that the Syrians become German, it's that there's some dynamic transformation. That seems to me the only way you can understand this, that you can abandon the foundational metaphysical concept of human and that version of human rights and that version of humanism, but also still understand what everybody is meaning when they say, I'm a human being too, I'm a man, and so on. So that's how, recognition is a misleading word, perhaps, but it's the best one that I have here. And maybe it has too much Hegel in it and a lot of other bad baggage, but I'm seeing it as an act of validation in which the validator has to undergo some kind of transformation itself.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a question about the frame of your talk, and so the case of Phil Collins in Kosovo, because I guess what we're trying to do is we're dealing with something that is very contemporary and very urgent, but then we are all going back in order to find, I guess, concepts and language in order to address it. Clearly, World War II and Hannah Arendt is one of these cases, but I wonder, and this is also what you suggested, whether or not Kosovo might be really the other point in time that we need to go back to, especially if we look at image politics and also, I guess, technologies of imaging, because this is, I guess, the humanitarian crisis where, for the first time, satellite images were used large scale in order to make human rights cases, and drones were used, and all sorts of things that I think are very much part of our contemporary moment. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more, I guess, about the connection to politics of images and imaging. And connected to that, I found it very interesting, the parts that you quoted from, I guess, the interview with Phil Collins about the relationship between the still and moving image, and that the people he encountered kind of posed as if they were posing for photographs, although what he was doing was shooting a film, so kind of working with moving images. And so I think what we're seeing today is that in a way this distinction between still and moving images is eroding, because almost all of the images we have are in some shape or form moving. So I wonder if today it would almost be the opposite, right? So that it's not so much about the still, but more about a moving image, and how that then relates to this condition of being constantly moving, or at least not be at rest. So.
Thank you. I was really struck in the Ai Weiwei exhibition by all the images from Macedonia. And I realized just sort of in a flash that Macedonia, 1999, Macedonia, the Macedonia's border, which was open to fleeing Kosovars in 99 and was closed to fleeing Syrians and Afghans in 2015. Everything we need to show on Macedonia, I think, here. So yeah, I think there's something changed technologically and aesthetically, and probably politically in '99 in those refugee camps. It was probably the first time in which victim and perpetrator exchanged email, or were able to talk on mobile telephones from the place of displacement and the place of arrival. You're right that it was a place where not quite the first, but the first widespread use of satellite imagery to document war crimes. And I think the first significant use of drones as military drones, but again, also for human rights investigative purposes. And it was completely, that space was completely saturated by cameras, by journalistic cameras, by NGO and military cameras, by overhead cameras, and by personal cameras. So it feels like it's where a lot of our present day refugee crisis reality began. And so I think you're right that one could begin to construct a new, or try to think of it as a new chapter in image politics of refugees. So I endorse that idea. I also think that there are powerful continuities still, in spite of technological differences between, there are photographs from the refugee camp that Arendt was in France, from the late 30s, early 40s as well, and they look remarkably like some of these pictures still. So this is where I'm maybe more of a theorist than a historian. I would just endorse your idea about still and moving. And I think you're right, probably, that the expectation today when a telephone camera is put in front of you is that a video is being made rather than a portrait being taken. And even the still images in my phone have a little bit of wiggle in them, right? I'm not sure. There are reasons to ask for a big distinction between still and moving, and I think other reasons to kind of fudge that distinction. I think it's important here just because because Collins quotes the eyewitnesses saying it, and it has to do with them standing still. Right? It's standing still as posing and not moving for fear of blurring. And I guess that fear is no longer one that we have particularly.
I was just kind of thinking about, you gave some historical examples, a couple from America, and then now to the current kind of crises between refugees at our own borders and refugees across the world. Is there something, do you think, specific maybe to Americans that we're missing, that we're not seeing other people as people? Because I feel like when you're looking at the news, it's constantly being brought up in the news, like, there are children at detention centers that are not being given proper care, or it's, mothers with babies that have drowned over in the Mediterranean, that you would seem to think would tug closest at people's heartstrings and kind of get them to recognize somebody else as human. But it doesn't seem to always make an effect when it gets to the political level in America. So is there something you think that maybe, I don't know, as artists, as educators, whatever, that we need to try to bring before the public to kind of change people's perception so that they become those kinds of insiders that make space for somebody who's outside.
That's definitely the name of the agenda. I don't know if there were some proven techniques, I would tell you. But I think that you're right. I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche, but I would be happy to go with it, that artists probably have a special role in this by virtue of the idea that they are in the business of making things that are hard to see or impossible to see or have never been seen before visible or hearable or smellable or whatever. But and I think that's something, I think in a way Collins was able to show us that scene of some kind of visibility and make it look different. If I showed you the whole film, that would have been much clearer to you, because over the 10 or 12 minutes, he slowly pulls the camera back and reveals that he's in this gaggle of other cameras doing something like the same thing. But in a way, the obvious visibility of the photo opportunity hides or screens from vision the circumstances in which the photo opportunity gets constructed, and that's where the crazy artist has the idea that that's the important thing to show. So I think as an analogy or as a metaphor for what aesthetic endeavors can do, that might be a good one. But when you said the difficulty of something like the difficulty of making it to the political level or of political pickup for what might be that many of us have emotional responses or ethical objections to what's happening at the border. That's the key, right? It's both to make that situation a political one and to persuade political leaders that there's something in it to take up that fight. So I think there has been a lot of pushback in the US and in Europe on this, but we're living in very divided times. So there's pushback and there's push. I don't know, I guess we're waiting or hoping or wishing for some more images that will make people see this a little differently, make more people see it a little differently.
So you started with the question, am I not a human being or a brother?
Yeah, am I not a man or a brother?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
A man or a brother. But the brotherhood, you didn't, I didn't get enough of that. They're not really the same, are they? Or?
Brotherhood means that, so you're all very kind and are not giving me a hard time about the gender politics of these utterances. So we're just going to pretend that they can be generalized. The way I understand man and brother there, and I did it very fast, I just said kinship about brotherhood. That just means there's a relation between us. It's not just that I'm something and you're one of those same things. It's that we're related as part of we're kin. We have a connection. So there's two modes of making a demand in that question. One is we're both the same thing, and the other is and we're connected through that same thing. That's the way I understand
But it just seems like you can recognize, or one could recognize someone as a human being, but not as a brother. Maybe the brother or whatever is the key to that. Yeah, you're right. I think that medallion is saying
being related, recognizing relation is the fastest route to treating me equally. Yeah. I'm hearing that that idea taken for granted maybe in some of the more condensed versions, the I am a man, for instance. It's counting on relationality there.
I have a question. So going back to the idea of recognition and what you were saying about recognition, and also sort of thinking of Anka's question, I guess I couldn't help thinking about the distinction between claiming recognition from the state and sort of doing politics and claiming recognition outside of the state. And I guess I was a little bit confused about whether you're intentionally collapsing those two categories, or whether it's not even important for refugees, or whether that is sort of the key importance, right? If we're talking about human rights, like, and I'm thinking particularly of sort of how, at least my geographical focus is on Latin America, and how there's sort of this push to do politics differently outside of the state, and thinking politics beyond the state, and particularly thinking as well of sort of the fact that identity politics gets for just constantly seeking recognition from the state, and whether that is sort of a failed project from the get-go. So I guess I just was wondering if you could speak a little further on that idea.
My instinct is to make recognition as broad a category as possible, and not certainly not limit it to recognition by the state. But my source, at least my initial source here, is Arendt, for whom the law and the state are essential. The critique that she makes in The Origins of Totalitarianism of the kind of hopeless idealism of human rights is precisely that no state or no law corresponds to the category human. And the only actionable rights, she says, that we have are those that we have as citizens, as members of a state. I think that there has been, first of all, there could be reasons to dispute her analysis there, and I think Jacques Rancière has a very good critical reading of that. But I also think that in the time since she wrote that, non-state actors, to speak like a political scientist, have acquired protective capacities and assertive capacities that maybe weren't there before. So we could call it sort of from the bottom up civil society or social movements. We could call it from the top down NGOs or the United Nations or the International Criminal Court or the ICRC, something like that. But I think there are institutions which are in the recognition granting and protecting business now in a way that there weren't so obviously for her. So I think that those non-state entities are increasingly the place to which people find themselves appealing for, excluded people find themselves appealing for recognition, or mobilizing themselves together, and pursuing alternative channels, skipping the state altogether. Yeah. So, but I think recognition can cover both of those, the state and the non-state side.
I don't know, I don't know if I with you.
Oh, no, but I just actually was curious, especially with the image you have here on the screens, about the status of children in all of this, especially when it comes to making a claim for political life, and the fact that, of course, in many of these cases, probably including the 15-year-old, under even kind of the most ordinary circumstances, these children don't have the same kind of claims to political life. So I'm wondering if you could speak more actually about, I mean, even including up to today, the children in camps, of course, and the references that you made in the talk. I'm just wondering if you could talk more about the status of children
And the use of images of children in something like Phil Collins' video, but also in just, again, a lot of the media attention that's been given to this issue. And that's probably a huge question, so please do it.
Yeah, that's an impossible question. But I would say I would have two maybe very different answers to that. I think, children are historically figures of innocence, and an entire kind of human rights and humanitarian apparatus has been built up on the image of children as innocent victims who need our protection, who need to be rescued and who need our protection. And I think that's given rise to, and the human rights and humanitarian communities know this as well, and there's been, decades of soul searching and then doing it anyway, and soul searching and then going back to doing it and so on, of using images of children to raise money and sympathy. So I think one can and should be critical of that. But I also think that children are super interesting for this particular question, given that we are generally inclined to count them as human beings, even if we don't count them as voters or as members of militias or and so on. So they already force us to expand some of the perimeter of this category, I think, in a useful and challenging way here. And to be asked to think about children as political claimants or as political actors then gets even more fun, because it also allows you to take on the innocence problem, right? If children are political agents or can be political agents, and I'm willing to go that far with these images, that Collins is talking about a situation in which these kids are making claims on him to be seen and to be represented. And that is, in that particular context at least, that's a political gesture in the context of having just been deported by an army. Then, innocence and politics don't really go together so well, so I think there's an interesting dynamic that you could set up between bad use of children, to speak crudely, bad and exploitative use of children, and kind of provocative use of children, partly to challenge the other image. Does that go somewhere?
So, maybe the last question, but I don't know. I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about maybe the distinction about photojournalistic or other images that socially construct refugees, either in a positive or a negative way, as human beings, and these artistic images, which in one way or the other, I think, are like this kind of double construct, where they almost sort of remove this kind of social construction as of being a refugee, and that this means also being human, to return them almost to a more human, a more unadulterated, a more pure human state. Specifically because many of these artists, like Phil Collins, but also like Sharon Lockhart, they spend a long time actually to also build this kind of trust between them and the refugees or other, people very often also children on the margins of society, so that they become the agent of their own image, as if to return them, or to whitewash them from these social constructs. Give them per se a dignity as humans again.
I'm not sure I can go there with you. I think the lesson that I take both from the art and from the theory is that that move that you're calling a return is a kind of constructedness to the second or the third power, maybe self-consciousness about constructedness. I think the video for me is a great demonstration of all the labor that's required in order to produce the image of the refugee, and then the revelation of that labor at the same time as we get to see Bashar tell his story. So there's constructedness, social constructedness is not, it's not necessarily a problem. It's also the opportunity by which the refugee gets to make a claim. The refugee is talking to the social constructors and has to appeal to that. There's no, you can't kind of reverse engineer it. You can maybe go beyond it by understanding it well enough. That's the way, I don't know, this, that's my take on, or my endorsement of Arendt's suspicion, critical suspicion of the idea that we can sort of go all the way down to the pure, or to the bare, or to the sheer or mere human, and find something there. For her, that's disposable, that's the superfluous, that's the totally unprotected. You need to get into the constructed zone in order to have a political life, in order to make claims, in order to defend yourself, and so on. You can't avoid that, I don't think. Do we have time for more questions? So on the right and then on the left.
Have you considered the relation of the sentence, I'm also human, to social psychology, where basically there's this kind of claim that you can see something as an object, or you can switch on your social cognition and see them as human beings and try to understand their feelings. So in this case, the sentence, I'm also a human, kind of asks you to switch on your social cognition and to understand something not only as a nuisance, but as a full human being. So a lot of what you're saying kind of seems to go in this direction.
That's true. I don't know that literature at all, but so is that different types of people do that differently, or just something triggers the switch in view?
It seems to be like a functioning of the human conscience, or a general insight of neuroscience, how the brain works, that there are different types of human thinking, and you can see something just as an object that moves, or you can kind of switch on and try to disencode like some intention or something like this.
Do they know what makes you switch on?
Yeah, for example, if you see a homeless person...
Because that could be the answer to the question over here.
If you only see, that was kind of what I thought. If you, for example, see a homeless person, you only see it as some danger and something is moving. But if you, for example, somebody asks you, what do you think this person could like which kind of food the person could like, then suddenly you switch on your social cognition and you're actually really looking at the person. So that's kind of, there's a lot of literature about it.
Yeah, I have it might be a bit of a broad question, but what do you think about using the human rights framework as a way to sort of address the refugee crisis that we are in, or is it the appropriate way to sort of understand and advocate for recognition and claims? And I know it has a fraught history, that framework has quite a fraught history, but in the present day with what we're seeing today, how do you view that framework in relation to what we're up against?
I think there's a lot of different human rights frameworks, and there's some which have clearly demonstrated their uselessness in these last 5 years, 10 years maybe. Particularly the, let's just pick easy targets like the official EU human rights bureaucracy has not done very well in coming to terms with what's happened on the edge of Europe. On the other hand, there are all kinds of insurgent, civil, grassroots, ground up, refugee to refugee activist projects which are reinventing the modes and tactics and strategies of human rights. It's a vague and hence highly mobile and appropriable vocabulary. So once you take it out of the technical bureaucracy of EU or the UN particularly, it's there, and I think it has considerable power operating in different ways on different levels. So I'm always in favor of disaggregating human rights. When we talk about that, there is no such thing as the human rights movement. There's no such thing as human rights as a package. There are, 20 different versions of declarations of human rights. So I think the proof is in what the people who are claiming the rights themselves for themselves do with that vocabulary. It seems like there's plenty of evidence that it's not dead yet. On that happy note, one last question.
Sure. I was fascinated by your analysis and with this Bosnian example. It seemed like the move you were making was that in general this kind of scene would be read as exploitation, objectification.
Right.
And because the apparatus is being staged and put on display, that kind of makes it okay. so I'm still wondering, and in some ways it really resonated with the film I saw back then, No Man's Land, which also does the same kind of dark comedic staging of the whole media apparatus in that war. So I'm wondering, in a way, it's also about irony and a kind of ironic self-reflection of the artist's role in this whole conundrum. And in a way, that's also maybe ticking in Arendt's texts with the whole ironic story.
It's incredibly ironic,
the over-assimilated Mr. Cohn who tries so hard to blend in and not help him. So basically, is your point then that, since we cannot escape the conundrum, we might as well face this, that we are trapped in this, sort of media production, and also as artists, as humanities scholars, as curators, we as filmmakers, we play our role within this, and the only redeeming thing we can do is actually take those claims that are being uttered on the ground seriously for what they say, and help put them on the public screen. So, I mean,
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm interested in. If we can have our irony and our seriousness too, that seems, that is what I take to Collins to be doing. He's not being a photojournalist, but he's doing what the photojournalists do, and something else. And the and doesn't cancel out. The something else doesn't cancel out the presentation. So he's able to show the showing of the wound and show the scene that makes that possible. But it doesn't function only as ironic subversion of the initial act. He gets to keep the initial act and comment on the fact that it's a production. And for me, that's a way of saying there are only ever going to be productions. The showing needs a stage. Showing is necessary. Showing needs a stage. Sometimes we can forget that there's a stage there, and then we might fall for some of the other tricks of a human rights vocabulary, for instance. But if we see the constructiveness of the scene and understand the necessity of that constructiveness, then we have a better shot at making this work. Is that what you were saying, or is that something different?
Yeah, but there is still an element of exploitation.
Exactly. No, and I think he's saying yes, and that's a compromise. We have to live with that. That there are demands placed on refugees, survivors, victims, and in another world it might be different, but there is some talking of that language is required. And you can put it in quotation marks so that you understand that could be different. Okay. Thank you all very much.